Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. My name is Ken Duke.
And I'm Terry Battisti. Our producer and engineer is Nathan Benson. And today's episode is all about personal bests.
Finally. Finally. You know, everybody's got a personal best story, and that's one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about yet, Terry, but that's one of the directions we want to go with the Big Bass Podcast.
Yeah, and what Ken and I want to do is we want to, get people on here, trophy hunters, professional tournament anglers, and get everybody's story about their biggest, bass that they've ever caught, be it a largemouth, a smallmouth, a spot. We've got one guy that's pretty impressive on all three realms. But to kick this, I guess we wouldn't call it a series, but maybe
a recurring motif. How about that?
We're gonna give you our PBs with respect to largemouth and smallmouth, and
yes. And I'm afraid of the beating that I'm going to take from Terry Battisti by the end of the show, but that's okay. I'm a big boy. I can take it. Yeah, because and we don't want to limit it just to trophy hunters, just to professional anglers or famous people. But hey, if you've got a great PB story, shoot us an email. Send us a little audio file. Tell us that story. Tell us the guts of that story, and maybe we'll have you on at some point, because, like I said, personal best stories are often very cool. A lot of the best bass fishing stories I've ever heard were about somebody catching their personal best. And when Terry couldn't do a show, this would have been back in March. Terry was out on assignment, I like to say, and he couldn't make a show. And Nathan and I put together an episode where we had a couple of guys you might have heard of. We had Bill Dance and Shaw Grigsby and Jeff Gustafson and Skeet Reese to talk about not their personal best, but ones that got away. And that's a theme we want to revisit as well. But if you've got a great story about a personal best, we don't call it PB. We don't call it PB here. I like calling it PBB, so everybody knows it stands for bass, and not trout or walleye or muskie or some other, lesser fish. So yeah, tonight we are all about personal bests. And Dr. Battisti, I would like you to kick things off with your personal best largemouth. How about that?
Yeah.
And hey, I would say it's Micropterus salmoides, but it ain't.
Yeah.
It's Micropterus, what is it, negricanus or something like that?
Something like that now. I can't remember. Yeah, it's
new name.
Changed on us. But yeah, so I have 3 fish over 10, but I'm going to talk about one specific trip that I took to the Delta, California Delta, not to be confused with the Louisiana Delta.
Which is the real Delta. Go ahead. California Delta.
The California Delta, and I believe it was in spring of 2009. And I had been working my butt off. I was living in Idaho at the time, and I hadn't had a break for months. And I left work one day, called my boss on the way home and said, "You're not going to see me next week. I'm gone." I literally went home, I hooked up the boat, and I drove the 800 miles from Idaho Falls, Idaho, to Frank's Track, which is a place that in the middle of the Delta and near Tracy. And I literally camped in the campground for about 2 hours before I had to wake up, and went out fishing for a few days. And this one day that I had, it was one of those days that you'll never forget. Overcast, there was a little bit of a ripple on the water, maybe a 2 or a 3 mile an hour wind. And I was fishing the South Delta, And I mean, the California Delta's got 2,000 miles of sloughs, and a bunch of big what they're all essentially old flooded farms. And I'm throwing a spook down this berm in between the first weed break and the second weed break. There's people down there. We used to call it Bass Alley, in between the two weed lines, and I'm working the spook, and this fish was easy 10, pushing, probably 11 or 12, comes up about 15 feet from the boat and eats the spook. And it goes down and it comes back up, and it has the spook in its mouth, and it's not just a spook, it's a super spook. So it's the big 3-hooker. And it has the thing in its mouth like this, and it shook its head, and the spook goes flying over my head. And I was like distraught. It's like, oh my God, how many opportunities do you get at a 10-pound fish anywhere? And just put my head down, and I think I picked up a chatterbait or something, and picked up a 7, 7.5, picked up a 6 3/4. Pulled the troll motor, went and motored down to another area, and I was throwing this crankbait, which is an Icon, which was made by Custom Lures Unlimited, a buddy of mine out of North Carolina, Kelly Barefoot, and it was the Icon, Ikon, and Mike Iconelli was at the time helping him promote this bait. And throwing it against the riprap, and the rod just stopped, the reel stopped, and I'm winding this fish in, and next thing I know, it's up at the boat. Holy crap, this is another big fish, another fish that is in that double-digit category. And I go to reach for the net, and it comes up and it opens its mouth. It was never hooked. Again, the plug flies out of its mouth. It's like just 20 pounds of fish and 2 fish. And I've lost them. So I'm, collecting my thoughts and continue fishing. And by the end of the day, I had... because I was going to take some pictures of the fish. I had 7.5, I had a 6.5. The smallest fish I had was 5.5. I had 2 of those. And I'm fishing another area down in the South Delta. This in current there is a huge deal because of the tidal shift. And I'm fishing as an outgoing tide, and all this water's pouring out of this lake. And I'm fishing the current seam, and I'm winding, and it felt weird. The vibration of the bait went away.
This is the crankbait again?
This is the crank, yeah, the Icon. Yeah.
Not that specific bait, though.
Not this specific bait, no. It just felt weird. And so I sped up on my retrieve, and the rod starts loading, and it ended up being a 10-1, 10-2, something like that.
Very nice.
And I have a picture of me holding 4 of the fish, and in the picture, the smallest fish there is 5.5 pounds, and the biggest is that 10. And I think I have the 10 and the 7 in the same hand, and I have a 5 and a 6.5. I couldn't hold 5 fish. But that's my biggest it's my biggest largemouth limit out of the Delta.
Very impressive.
Yeah, and I lost. If I had those 2 10s, that would have been a really impressive. The other 2 10s that I lost, that would have been a really impressive picture.
Now, as far as you know, was one of your fish from that day the biggest bass you've ever hooked? As far as you know, have you ever hooked a fish you thought was decidedly bigger than that?
Yeah, it happened when I was 14 years old.
Ah,
That fish haunts me to this day. It was at Lake.
sorry to laugh, but the way you said that was funny.
Was horrible. I mean,
So you're 14 years old on Castaic, so it's the late 70s.
yeah,
And
1978.
okay,
Yeah,
so
my
this
dad and
is
I.
not quite the heyday of Castaic yet. Castaic is still maybe a few years away from its prime for pumping out the 18s, 19s. But I'm sure there had to be some 15s and 16s coming out at that point.
At that point in time, there were mostly
Probably a lot of 12s and 14s.
a lot of 12 to 14 pound fish, a lot of 12s. I was working at the tackle shop. That was the first year I was working there. And we were weighing in because we would collect fish for anglers and send them to Robert's Fish Mounts. So guys knew that they could bring their 10 in, and we send it off to the taxidermist.
And these are skin mounts that are getting done.
No, at the time this was all plastic mounts. They weren't skin
Okay.
mounts.
But you're
this
still
is
sending
how-
the fish in?
Yeah, because at that point in time, I mean, you're talking late 70s, they did not have molds for all these different dimension fish.
Gotcha.
And, you could have 10-pound fish that varied in length and girth by a tremendous amount. And it's one of the reasons that you probably want to get a fish mounted maybe out of California by Lyons and O'Haver. I don't know if they're in business anymore, or Roberts. And they probably duplicated these molds. But by the time I left California in 93, you could go to those and you could actually get a mount that was within an eighth of an inch of your actual measurement, girth or lengthwise. That's how many molds that they made from those early days. But yeah, so I mean, we were taking in anywhere from 20 to 30 fish a week to go to the taxidermist. And the guys would bring the fish in. Everybody that was in the shop would throw $1 on the counter, and the person that guessed the weight correctly on the shop scale, won every dollar bill that was up on the counter. And so I got pretty dang good at guessing weight within a couple of ounces of fish. And so my dad and I, we had the sea nymph, 15-foot sea nymph aluminum bass boat. And we get up in the morning. My mom, of course, at the time, she gets up and makes us breakfast. And I mean, this is like 3:30 in the morning. And before we left, before I got in the car, because we towed it with a 1971 Datsun 510 station wagon.
Hey, man, station wagons were the kings of the road in the 70s. Come on.
Yeah. And she gives me a hug and a kiss, and she says, catch a lunker for me today.
Ooh.
Yeah. And,
That's what a nice memory. What a really nice memory.
Yeah. And I didn't think much of it. And so we go out, launch the boat, head over to this one point that we like to fish. And we put the boat on the bank, and we fish casting out with 6-inch worms and working them uphill, which is the standard California tactic back in the day. And
sure, get in a boat so you can fish like you're on the bank. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I cast probably into 45 or 50 foot of water, and I hadn't worked it in 10 feet, and the line jumped, and I'm fishing a Phoenix boron rod, a 1500C Abu, and 8-pound Maxima line.
That's primo stuff right there.
Yeah, and I set the hook and bring in the fish in. The fish is coming straight up. It comes straight up, and it doesn't break the water, but it starts charging the boat. And with a 1500C, there's no...
Yeah, that's like 7 inches of line you're gaining with each turn.
Exactly.
That's nothing. The 1500 is the smallest bait caster of the time, basically, and the gear ratio on that, you're probably very lucky if it was 5.5 to 1.
Oh no, it was 4.7 to 1.
Okay, everything was 4.7 to 1 back then. So yeah, that was an uphill battle. But forget 4.7. That was a tiny spool.
Mm-hmm.
So you were not even picking up nearly as much line as a 5500.
Oh no.
Yeah,
not at all.
that's
Yeah,
that,
but I'm keeping a bend in the rod, and the
and
fish is coming to the
it's probably a
boat.
5.5 foot rod, right?
Well, I got the rod right over here. Let me go get it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Terry Battisti has left the building. We're not sure if he's coming back. We'll see. He's got the Phoenix boron rod, I think. For those of you who are not familiar with boron as a rod material, after graphite had been on the market for 4 or 5 years, suddenly some companies like Shakespeare and Phoenix and some others decided that, oh, boron's going to be the next big thing and let's introduce it. Well, boron never really caught on. Terry can probably tell us about the properties of boron that cause it not to be a success, but it was more expensive for one thing and turned out to be not a significant improvement over graphite.
Yeah. Yep. So this is the rod. It's not the reel. That's a 4500C. That's a 1980 version or an 82 version of a 4500 CB. 1500s
With
on
the
another rod
smooth
over there.
palming side, by the way, one of the
Exactly.
early ones with a smooth palming side.
But yeah, that's the rod, a pistol grip 5.5 footer.
Oh yeah, pistol grip.
Yeah,
For
and
those of you who've not thrown a pistol grip, that thing is crazy comfortable. If you're making a lot of short, little underhanded roll casts, nothing better than a pistol grip.
yep, and the fish gets about, I don't know, 8 to 10 feet away from the boat, and it surfaces, and I get a good look at it, and my knees started shaking, and it sounded at the edge of the boat. My dad missed it with the net.
Oh,
It, and the fish just went, and back. I mean, there was drags back then sucked, and it popped. It broke me off, and I sat down in the front seat and cried. And I still have nightmares about that fish to this day, because that fish was well over 11 pounds. It was big. It was big.
yikes!
It would have been my PB to this day. It
Well,
was horrible.
I've got
I cry
a,
now.
we'll give you some time to compose yourself, and if you're ready, I'll go into a story
Let's hear it,
about
Ken.
my PB, which is I'm going to tell a story first about my personal best smallmouth, which is not an impressive fish. Well, it's an impressive fish for me. It would be a nice fish of the day for a lot of people in a lot of places, but it's not going to dazzle anybody. It's a very fond memory because I was fishing with some good people on a legendary body of water. This would have happened about 15 years ago on Dale Hollow Lake, which produced, of course, the world record smallmouth bass, and probably about half of the legit smallmouths over 10 pounds in history have come out of Dale Hollow Lake on the Tennessee-Kentucky border. If you haven't checked out our 3-episode series on the world record caught by David Hayes back in 1955, please do so. We'll put a link somewhere over my head or Terry's head. And it's a 3-part series. You watch that, you'll know more than any of your friends about the world record smallmouth bass, I guarantee it. In the early 2000s, in 2002, I started going to Dale Hollow pretty much every winter for 3 or 4 days at least. And I would catch up with some buddies there, and we'd stay in one of the marinas right on the water, Horse Creek or someplace like that, or Cedar Hill. And we were always treated so well. I did a lot of writing and other things about that fishery, and that town of Salina, Tennessee, just really welcomed me with open arms. I got the key to Clay County one time, and that was pretty neat. But anyway, so I'm up there. In fact, Terry, I'm up there with our partner and producer engineer extraordinaire, the lovely and talented Nathan Benson, the songbird of our generation. And we're going out every day, and we're using what's called a float and fly technique. We'd go up there in the winter, and the key to the float and fly technique is, I'm sure it was then, and I'm sure it's got to be to this day, is the water really needs to be below about 53, 55 degrees for these fish to start collecting up and being responsive to that method. I can only imagine what forward-facing sonar is doing to float and fly fishing, but I'll bet it is outrageous with that kind of technology. Because back in the day, and I hate to reference 15 years ago as back in the day, I'm too old for that, but back in the day, you'd go out there and you'd hit these massive shale rocky points, knowing that it looked so incredibly fishy. It looked like a postcard that one bass would send to another and say, "Wish you were here." It was that smallmouth intense. And a float and fly rod is let's say, an 8.5 to 11 foot spinning rod with all the backbone of a spaghetti noodle that's been in boiling water for about 10 minutes. And, and
So
you
it's
put
al
it,
dente.
it's, no, it's not al dente. It's the opposite of al dente. It is, the life has been cooked out of it. It's a very soft action rod. And you put pretty much any spinning reel on it, but a nice light action spinning reel um, that can handle 4 to 6 pound braid probably is your best bet. Something like a fire line. And to that you tie a three-way swivel, and to the other one of the other ends of the three-way swivel you tie a length of fluorocarbon line, usually 4 maybe 6 pound test, and that the length of that line would be how deep your jig would go. So you're really talking about 9 to say 11 or 12 feet long to fish the jig that deep. On the third prong of the three-way swivel, you clip a float, a styrofoam or cork, or a styrofoam cork, or even a plastic float. And the best of them are weighted so that the bobber doesn't turn upright with the little red button on the white side, doesn't turn up until the jig has bottomed out and reached the nadir of its sink. And you sling that thing out there, and it's an acquired skill to cast a float and fly rig. But you sling that thing out there, and you let it get to the bottom. Then you just kind of jiggle the rod tip, and you kind of walk it back to the boat slowly, slowly, at least until you get past the area where you think the fish are. And when the bobber either turns on its side, indicating a fish has taken the jig. Oh, and the jig, by the way, is usually a 1/16 or 1/8 ounce. Looks like a crappy jig, uh, but it's usually a craft hair or a feathered jig, and it's got a bass hook on it, like a number 1 bass hook, and that's your bait. So if you're out there jiggling along and shaking it, making that jig dance under the water, and the bobber turns on its side, indicating a fish has grabbed it and moved up, or sinks below the water surface like a bluegill taking a cricket, you set the hook, and you're in for a legit 5-minute fight, because you've got very little backbone on this rod. Your line is very light. You don't have to worry much about the fish breaking off unless your drag is too tight, because there's not a lot of obstructions in a lot of places there. But it's amazing. It's a lot of fun. The fish put up a great fight, and it's a two-person deal. You really can't go float and fly fishing by yourself because you can't net the fish unless you've got like a 15-foot net handle. So you got to have a buddy in the boat with you to do that. So anyway, I'm out there fishing with a couple of friends, and there's a group of us out there that day, several media people, and nobody was catching them but me. And I had discovered this one little goofy trick that was working for me, and that is I would sling the thing as close to the bank as I could, and it had these little stair step ledges in the shale, and I would only get bit if I slung it up there close enough to the bank that the jig landed on the bottom, landed on one of the stair steps, but didn't bottom out the line. It landed, and my cork never righted itself. And then I had to gently pull it off that ledge and get it to swing down to the next level, and that's when I'd get bit. So I'm not exaggerating when I say I caught 6 or 8 fish that day, and only one other person out of 6 or 8 people caught one. Wow. So that's probably the biggest whooping I've ever put on a group of people. And believe me when I say, about the only time I've ever done that. So, but my best fish that day weighed about 5'8", and I'll put a picture of it up here. Just a really good time a really neat technique. I fell in love with that technique, and unfortunately, I haven't been back to use it again. But I don't know exactly how popular float and fly fishing is up there right now. I expect it's still pretty hot, and I expect that in this era of forward-facing sonar, it's stronger and better than ever. I can only imagine what a skilled angler with forward-facing sonar could do today with a good float and fly rig, because forward-facing sonar is made for that technique.
Yeah.
That's my
Wow.
smallmouth story. Not wildly impressive, especially when you're talking about a lake that has produced an 11-15 and multiple fish over 10. But I was pretty excited about that
Yeah,
fish. I've
but
caught a lot
I
over 5, ironically.
but when was the last time that Hollow produced a fish over 9? It's
You
been
know,
years.
well, I hear about them occasionally. You don't see them very often, but I know it produced a 9 in the 2000s. Um, a fish about 9 pounds out of Dale Hollow made the cover of Bassmaster not all that long. Well, I say not all that long ago. In the last 20 years, it has.
Hmm.
Um, but what's weird about Dale Hollow and its production of big fish is it doesn't seem to be terribly cyclical like a lot of waters. A lot of the Texas waters are very cyclical, no matter what Sherlunker may tell you. OH Ivy is wearing them out this year. I don't believe OH Ivy is going to be kicking them out a year from now, 2 years from now. Certainly
No,
not 4 years from now. Okay, that's
no.
just my bet. It might for the next year or two, but it's gonna slow, and then it's gonna basically stop producing all these 14, 15 pound plus fish.
Right.
The California lakes were largely cyclical. Now, I'm speculating that they're not producing these fish because they're losing uh, the genetic uh, power of these fish. They're losing the genetics of the pure Floridas in the largemouth world. But Dale Hollow doesn't have that issue. These are just smallmouth bass. Some people have speculated that they are genetically different than other smallmouth bass, but as far as I know, there's no proof of that. Uh, it produced obviously an 11-15 in 1955. It produced a 10-8 in 1969. It produced another 10 plus in the
A
mid
10-15,
80s.
I think in 10-15 in 59. I
Uh,
just ran across that fish today.
yeah, it produced a Paul Beal fish. It produced a John Gorman fish over 10. It produced two Billy Westmoreland fish over 10 in the 70s.
Yeah.
So it's cranked out some tens, and you'd have to say that its heyday was the mid 50s through, I don't know, mid 80s at the latest, late 60s at the earliest. And I still think it's the best place to go if you want to have a chance at a double digit smallmouth. But places like Dwarshak in Idaho, or even uh, some of the places way up north like Erie, or
Hmm.
maybe even the Niagara River or Buffalo River. I don't know. Maybe they produce something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard recently, since moving to Tennessee, that the largemouth are hurting the smallmouth population there. They're catching a lot of 6 to 8 pound largemouth up there that they never did in years past.
And we hear about that. We hear about that, destroying a spotted bass fishery like Lake Paris in California,
Yeah.
when it was the best smallmouth trophy lake in the world for quite a while. But then some bucket biologists who thought, well, if it's this great for spots, maybe it can finally churn out that world record largemouth we want so bad.
Yeah.
Instead, it destroyed what was a great spotted bass fishery.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right, Doctor, it's your turn to talk smallmouth bass.
Yeah. This is another one of those pinch me, am I dreaming trips. I
Don't
have,
let him kid you, folks. Terry just likes people to pinch him. It's strange. It's a
well, true.
fetish.
I befriended. There was a large group of us on a website called the Bass Fishing homepage. Back
Oh, back in the
started
message board days. I remember
back
the
in the
bass
message
fishing
board days.
homepage.
Yeah, I mean it was 1995. It started, and by 1998, there was a group of us that had become really tight, and we started congregating down in Texas to rallies and fishing with each other for 3 or 4 days. And we had a couple of guys that would come down from Canada. One of them was named Charles Nom. Used to go by the tag Outsider on the BFHP. And he kept telling me year after year, oh, I got to start setting something up for Erie, because Erie in the fall just goes bonkers. And it took, 7 years for him to finally arrange this, mini rally, we called it, up there in Toronto. And so I went up there. It was me and the Canadian contingent. And I fished with, I flew into Buffalo, and Charles, and this is J.P. DeRose, it's Dave Mercer back in 2006, who nobody knew who the heck they were. But I knew them from the message board. And they're setting me up to fish with a guy by the name of Simon Frost. Unbeknownst to me, Simon Frost is the best guide on Erie out of Toronto, arguably out of Erie, period. And, so Simon picks me up in the morning and says, yeah, we should do pretty good today. I went out yesterday afternoon for a couple hours, did pretty well on a couple of reefs. And he said, the only thing is you're not afraid of big water, are you? I said, no, I grew up on the ocean. He goes, okay. I said, and then I told him, because I had no clue how big the water was. And I'm not talking how big Lake Erie is. I'm talking 6,
Waves.
8 foot swells.
Yeah.
And he had his butt seat in the front and a butt seat in the back, and I told him, you can get rid of that butt seat, I'll stand. And he kind of looked at me. He kind of looked at me like, okay, let's see how this works out. And he puts the butt seat in the rod locker. And we get out there, and it reminded me of being on the Pacific Ocean in a bad storm. It was 6 to 8 footers. Thank God he knows how to drive a boat, and if he doesn't and he lives up there, he shouldn't be on the water to begin with. And we get out there, and I jump out of the seat and I pick up a rod. He had told me that we're going to be fishing tubes in 35 to 45 foot of water. And so I get up on the back deck and almost fall off the boat. I mean, because we're, going like this in, from a 6, 8 foot swell down into the trough and then back up. In the meantime, he's trying to set up 2 drift socks or sea anchors, whatever you want to call them. And so he gets one set off the stern, he gets one set off the bow, and we start this drift that he's going to use the swell to push us along this reef. And I finally get my footing, I fire a cast out, my tube is sinking, and it gets to the bottom and the line jumps, and I set the hook into a 4-pound fish. That was my first Lake Erie fish. By the end of the day, I don't know how many drifts we made. And at this point, the winds died down, but you still have this remnant, 6 footers that, are they're pain. But he actually had rod holders. We had one placed on the bow and he had one placed on the stern. And when I first saw him, I thought, well, he's a guide, so maybe he's crappie fishing in the summertime or something like that. No. In Canada, you're allowed to use 2 rods if you're not fishing a tournament. And so he gets the drift sock set up. He picks up a rod, fires a cast out, sticks it in the rod holder, and then picks another rod up and makes a cast. By the time that bait hit the bottom that's in the rod holder, it's bent over. He's got a fish on. So he puts the rod in his hand in the rod holder and starts bringing in a fish. It's a 5-pounder. We made probably 30 drifts that day on 2 different shoals. By the end of the day, we had over 200 fish, and we both had limits that were over 30 pounds.
Amazing.
My limit was 31 and a half pounds, anchored by a 6 3/4. They were all cookie cutter fish, and I have a picture up here of only 2 of those fish, and it's a bad picture. Remember, I'm 6'3" and I weigh 250 pounds, and I'm wearing bibs and a very big jacket. So the fish don't look like they're 6.5 to 6 3/4 pounds.
So if they even look like a keeper, they're 5 pounds.
We counted. We counted every fish that came over the gunnel. We had more than 50 fish that were 5 pounds or bigger that day.
That's amazing.
It was the most incredible
That's one
day
of the
of
greatest
fishing I
smallmouth
think
days I've ever heard of.
It was unbelievable.
Say no, that's not the word.
Insane. It was frickin' sane.
Tag it, Nathan. 36 minutes in. Tag it.
Yeah, that's the first time I've said that word in about 4 episodes.
I've missed it.
Yeah, it was crazy. So the next day I go out with JP, and JP and I we had over 100 fish that day, and our biggest 5 together were over 30 pounds. And then the third day we went out, and I fished with Charles that day, and we had 80 fish, and I think our biggest 5 went 29 pounds. It was Simon and I had at least a half a dozen quadruple hookups because we're fishing 2 rods at a time, right? And you're fighting these 5 pounders and 4 3/4 pounders. You've got 2 rods in your hands and you've got big fish on both of them, and you're trying to figure out which one's the biggest so you can put the smaller fish rod in the rod holder so you could concentrate on getting the bigger fish in the boat. I mean, it was crazy. Triple hookups, I have no idea how many of those we had, and double hookups. It was, and mind you, at this time of the year, so this is the second week in November up there, it's getting dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Wow,
it gets early. Daylight at 8. So you're fishing from 8 to 4. You don't have a very long day, and to catch 200 fish in a day like that, I mean, it was crazy.
That's amazing, and fighting for your life on the high seas.
Exactly. By the way, it took him about 15 minutes, or took me about 15 minutes of stumbling on the back deck to ask him for the butt seat out of the rod locker.
After too many neck and back surgeries and spinal fusions, I would not have even gone out on the water that day.
I was a little bit more nimble then.
Yeah,
it's like it's almost 20 years ago.
Then I might have been able to do it. Yeah, back then I might have been able to do it, but today, too many surgeries, too many back and neck problems, not a chance. That's phenomenal. That's one of the greatest days of smallmouth bass fishing I've ever heard of.
Yeah, it was. I came back. I wrote an article because that was the day that I met Dave Mercer. And I came back and I wrote an article that went into Bass West, and I got some pictures of Dave, holding big smallies and all that. And it turned out that Simon got about 50 guide trips because of that article that was in Bass West. He'd call me up, dude, I got five guide trips booked for this week because of that article. I mean, it was.
I'll bet he got a lot more than 50 because a lot of those people, I'm sure, became repeat customers. So that number is probably in the hundreds by now.
Well, the interesting thing is that the number of Elite Series anglers that booked him.
Ah.
Yeah, that was the interesting thing. You can't believe who booked a trip with me.
Can you out those people for us right here and now on the Big Bass Podcast?
Oh,
come on.
No.
Come on. Everybody wants you to do it.
I have a clearance. I can't do that kind of crap.
You don't have a clearance in the sport of bass fishing. There's no such thing.
Anyway.
Come on. All right. All right.
Anyway, so what about your largemouth story, Ken?
Okay, I'm gonna put on the armor here because I'm about to take a beating from Dr. Terry
Like I did
Joseph
last night?
Battisti. He's referring to the inaugural episode of Bass After Dark, which is a new evening late night talk show. You can find on YouTube. Just search Bass After Dark show. Check out our inaugural effort, if you will, which has Dr. Terry Battisti, none other than Mark Jeffries from Bass Talk Live fame, the founder of that, and our good buddy Mike Davis, who's been on the Big Bass podcast.
Yeah.
And we were talking about who should be on bass fishing's Mount Rushmore. So check it out.
Yeah.
Now it's my turn to talk largemouth. And you talked about how when you were 14, I think you said you had a shot at your biggest bass ever. Well, I actually caught my biggest bass ever when I was 12, which was approximately 1 million years ago, and the Earth was still cooling, and the primary means of human death on the planet was attacks by Tyrannosaurus rexes. So actually, I was 12 years old, so it was 1974, fall 1974. I'm in 7th grade. I've got a football game. I've got a middle school football game later that day. Hollywood Hornets, Saluda County, South Carolina. That's where I was living at the time, and lived on a farm. My family had a farm there, 107 acres, and beef cows and stuff. And if you got a farm, you got to have either a creek or a pond. And I was really lucky because we had both. I could take a little ultralight spinning outfit down to the creek and catch 100 little bluegill and panfish and little bass in a couple hours, or I could go down to the pond, which is probably acre and a half, and try to catch a bass. And I'd bass fished earlier in life before moving to Saluda County, South Carolina. When I was growing up in Miami, Florida. The canals there hold some pretty good fish. But anyway, so moved to the farm. I'm in the 7th grade, got a football game later that day, so I can't do much. My grandfather's in town from Alabama. And I don't even know, I guess just because I love fishing so much, I decided that a good pre-football game activity would be to go down to the pond and fish. And so I took my best rod and reel, which at that time would have been a really whippy action 6.5 foot yellow eagle claw rod. Really, they were making yellow rods back in the 70s. And some no-name reel and line that was probably the same line that was on the reel when I bought it, or when it was given to me by my parents or grandfather. And I had a hook and a slip sinker, or not a slip sinker, a pinch on split shot, and a worm. I have told people through the years it was a man's jelly worm. It was a night crawler.
What?
Don't tell anyone.
Oh God, you freaking bait fisherman!
It was. I was 12. Back off. The story gets worse. The story gets worse.
Man, I thought that was the climax of awfulness right there.
No, it gets far worse. So I sling that night crawler out there, and later I learned that I had probably landed it on the edge of a weed line that I discovered. But at the time, when I was 12 and was still fairly new to the farm, I didn't really know that I'd thrown it right where I would have wanted to throw it. And it touched down, and I've got holding the rod in my hand, not really paying that much attention, looking around, because I was scared to death of snakes, which is different from now, because I am scared to death of snakes at all times, 12 and now at 61. So all of a sudden the line starts moving, and I say, okay, this is probably an opportune time to set the hook. So I set the hook, probably woefully inadequately, but luckily the bass I didn't gut hook this fish, Not that it mattered, but I didn't gut hook this fish. I set the hook. He immediately comes out of the water because, I mean, he was in only 3 or 4 feet of water. And I managed to, he jumped 3 times, cleared the water. Biggest thing I'd ever seen. Had no idea that this little farm pond could produce such a beast. Get it to the bank, land it, run, grab it by the lower jaw, and run back to the house, which would have been several hundred yards, probably 250, 300 yards away. I don't think I ever broke stride, and showed my grandfather, who was the guy who really gave me my passion for fishing. But he wasn't down there at the pond with me when I caught the fish. So I take it to him, and I'm going to show you all a picture of that fish right here. It's a god-awful picture. It's a god-awful picture of 12-year-old me in a straw cowboy hat and holding the fish. No, I'm wearing shoes. We had shoes. Holding up a fish in exactly the wrong pose to show off the size of this fish. And my grandfather at least had the presence of mind to take some pictures of this fish. I remember I had other pictures, but I don't know what happened to them. I haven't ever seen them. I haven't seen them in decades. But I have this one picture, and we didn't have a scale to do it. We didn't even have a Zebco D lyre, which is, that was the standard back in the day. I don't know that anybody had anything better than a Zebco D lyre in 1974.
Which was originally a Langley lyre.
There you go. But I didn't have such a thing. So my grandfather suggested we get the bathroom scales out. My mom got the bathroom scales out, and I stepped on the scales without the fish in my hands, and then I stepped on the scales with the fish in my hands. And no, Terry, I didn't have the fish and a bowling ball and an anvil. It was just me and the fish.
And who did the math for you?
I can do basic math. But luckily I had 2 adults there with me to also do the math. And the difference was just slightly over 12 pounds. So I have ever since estimated that fish at 12 pounds, 4 ounces. Now, and I also measured the length of the fish. It was a little bit longer than 27 inches long.
That's a good fish.
It's a really good fish. It's still the longest fish I've ever caught. That was a bass, and I'm certain it's the heaviest fish I've ever caught. But here the story gets worse. Of course, I had carried this fish through. It was probably September. I don't even remember what month it was. And this fish is long dead now. So there, in my mind, there was no such thing as catch and release for a 12-year-old. It was catch, batter, and fry. And I had some limited fish cleaning skills, but
I'd say.
But I didn't know how to fillet a fish. I needed my dad for that, and he was off at work. So and my grandfather, for whatever reason. Well, my grandfather didn't really keep fish that much, so he wasn't going to fillet that fish. I started to cut into the fish, behind the gill plate, and then I got down to the backbone of the fish, and it was as big around as a 50-cent piece. And of course, nobody today knows what a 50-cent piece is, but Terry and I are old enough to know what a 50-cent piece is. I had to get out an axe to chop through the backbone of the fish, and I wound up cleaning the fish.
Did you nail its head to a tree?
No, that's what you do for catfish. But I've done that many a time to skin a catfish.
You're treating this bass like a catfish with an axe.
I did not nail the fish's head to a tree. Anyway, I cleaned the fish. I did kind of sort of fillet it because after I got the sides off, I cut out the rib cage and I managed to get the scales off. I probably scaled the fish rather than did it the conventional fillet method. But we ate that fish, and I felt a little bit like George Perry at that moment. And no, I didn't feel like George Perry. I actually had a fish, so that makes me different than George. So anyway, that's my PB largemouth story. Caught it on a night crawler, weighed it on bathroom scales. filleted it and used an axe to cut its head off. How about that?
It's awful. It's golly.
Are you disgraced
know
to
what
be
to
doing this
say.
show with me? Are you disgraced now? Or are you going to have to resign or fire me from the show?
I threw up a little bit in my mouth. I mean, it was. Oh,
You and Nathan are going to
Kenneth.
disown me and vote me off the show.
Oh boy.
I'm going to get a memo later today that just says the tribe has spoken, and I'm gone.
Well, I mean, if I had caught the fish that I lost when I was 14, it would have gone home with me. You know, I mean, that's what you did back then, right? You know, I would have at least given it some dignity and made a mount out of it. I wouldn't have eaten it, but I would have killed it, you know, and then once it's dead, it doesn't matter really what you're going to do with it. So at
There
least
you
got
go.
something out of it.
And most every biologist I've talked to over the last 20 years has told me that catch and release has probably gone too far and that we should be eating more of these fish. I like eating fish. I don't do it that often, but that's mostly because it's trouble, you know. Got to clean them.
Yeah.
My wife is not that crazy about frying them up, so we don't eat a lot of fish anymore. But if you catch them and you take them home and you eat them, by God, that's your right. I'm proud of you.
Yeah.
Don't do it to a world record. Too many
No.
people have already done that. It's not a good play. Could cost you a lot of money. But yeah, I did that with that fish, and my real regrets about that fish are that I didn't get better measurements on everything. That I didn't have a good scale to weigh it on. Just didn't do more to memorialize that fish.
Nope.
But it was fun to catch it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And remember, if anybody asks you what Ken Duke caught his PB on, black jelly worm. Not true, of course, but
of the nightcrawler kind.
yeah. What is it that trout fly guys call, grasshoppers, crickets, and earthworms? They call them garden hackle.
I've actually done a lot of fly fishing, and I'd never heard that term.
Never heard of garden hackle?
No.
Oh man, yeah.
Nope.
Garden hackle. That's the ticket right there. All right, Doctor.
Cool. Yeah.
Hey, folks, those are our PBs on largemouth and smallmouth. If you'd like to take a more active part in our show and will do us the favor of sending us a little bit about your PB, maybe we'll select it and get you on the show. We certainly plan to bring in some bigger, better names than just Terry Battisti and Ken Duke on this. But I enjoyed it, Doctor. That was fun.
Yeah, it was a good time.
It's a weight off my shoulders and off my soul to tell the whole truth about my personal best largemouth.
Because we've known each other for
Long time.
a long time, and you have never told me in that time that you caught it on a nightcrawler, ever.
No.
Tonight you came clean.
I did.
I mean,
I'm not proud. but I am
Yeah.
I am saved. I am saved.
yeah. Well, I guess we can close the door or slam the door on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. But before we do, please remember to subscribe, like, share, give us comments or a review. We love talking to you guys in the comment section. It's a small ask, but every bit helps. Don't forget to check out the website at thebigbasspodcast.com. You'll find the Big Bass Podcast calculator, our listings of record bass and supplementary material and episodes. As always, it's a work in progress. If you want to contact us, our email addresses are ken@thebigbasspodcast.com, terry@thebigbasspodcast.com, and nathan@thebigbasspodcast.com. I'm Terry Battisti on behalf of my partners, Ken Duke and Nathan Benson. Thanks for joining us tonight. And next week, or in a couple weeks, we'll have a new show about a different big bass with a story that you will not and cannot find anywhere else. And remember,
size matters, even if you catch it on a night crawler.